You are listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that's always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here are your hosts, Mark Dailey and Kevin Laramée.
Hey everybody, what is up? Welcome to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One. How's your week going? Are you still sticking to your New Year's resolutions, or are they already fallen by the wayside a week into the new year? If you have, don't feel too bad about it. I read somewhere that most people don't make it out of the month of January when it comes to your resolutions, but hey, if you picked up a couple of good habits along the way, then good for you. Anyways, a busy show this week. There's been quite a bit of news, which is usually a time of year when it's fairly quiet in the F1 world. And the big one this week is the news that Ferrari and Maurizio Arrivabene have parted ways after a poor 28 season. And I must admit, my first reaction was shocked. But not really. When you look back and think that that really was a season that got away from Ferrari, that really was the one where they should have won one or both of the world championships, either the drivers or the constructors. And of course, there's plenty of blame and lots of finger pointing that can be done. The team has to take their own fair share of responsibility. Maurizio Arrivabene for some of the management errors, specifically some of the interesting strategy choices, and the one that does come to mind is the poor tire or wrong tire choice that they put them out on in qualifying in Japan. And of course, Sebastian Vettel has to shoulder his fair share of the blame. A lot of the mistakes that happened were his faults and his alone. Then there were driver error, no doubt about it. And that really was the season, like I say, that got away from them. It was a very competitive car that they fielded last year in the SF71H, and it was disappointing. Mercedes, of course, should be congratulated. They were the much more consistent team over the course of the 21 race season, and at the end they were the ones that took home all the trophies again, all the silverware, another world championship for Lewis Hamilton, another constructors championship for the team, which is 5 in a row, and 5 world championships for Lewis. And Ferrari, obviously, they need to get something done. They need to find that key component that's going to take them forward. And of course, Arrivabene he shouldn't be completely criticized and leave under a cloud or under shame, because there's no doubt that Ferrari did increase in competitive and become a more regular challenger, and basically the only challenger to Mercedes. It's just a shame that the season that they had, which was obviously highlighted, unfortunately, by the untimely death of Sergio Marchionne, the president, at the end of the summer there. And obviously that cast a cloud over the entire company and the team. But that was just one episode in the entire year. Of course, everything that was happening on the track and in the pits, that's basically what really caused the big problems, because they really should have done better. So now Mattia Binotto, he is the chief technical officer, and he's been at Ferrari for over 20 years. He started there in 1995 as a race test engineer, and since became a race engineer, he was involved in the engine, the KERS department in 2016, and he was made the chief technical officer in 2016 after James Allison, who was his predecessor, moved over to Mercedes. So he's been given a lot of credit actually, for the strides that Ferrari have made over the past couple of years. And well, talk about a high pressure job in professional sports and professional motorsports. I don't think there's any bigger job or one that's under a bigger microscope than it is at Scuderia Ferrari. So he's going to have to get the team focused. There's no word on who's going to replace him. And Binotto, he does have a big job. Obviously, it's interesting when you look at the situation. You have Vettel, the 4-time world champion, who struggled last year, obviously, and had that championship get away from him. You have the young up-and-coming Charles Leclerc, who's joining from Sauber. And that is one situation that we'll have to keep an eye on, because I think it really does point to the fact that I don't think that Vettel's the clear number one there. I think he is on paper, but I don't think his status is completely secure as it might be. I think that he really needs that challenge. His preference would have been for Kimi Räikkönen to stay another year, and why wouldn't it be? He's friends with Kimi, and he was a little bit naturally quicker than Kimi. Although as the season wore on and as the fight really left Vettel, once it became more and more obvious that even though there was a mathematical chance he could win the championship, that it was basically Lewis's to lose at that point, that Kimi actually sped up and was able to perform better at times than Vettel down the stretch run there, who's tipped to be the next big thing in Formula One. Well, the year before, 2 years ago, was Max Verstappen that was tipped to be the next big thing in Formula One. Well, we'll see how that works out in the future, but definitely Leclerc has performed very well in the time that he spent so far in Formula One, and he is a Ferrari Academy product, and he really is getting the chance now that most guys really don't get, because they really haven't taken historically a chance on younger drivers. So not only does Binotto have to worry about what's happening in the design room and in the factory, and why it's what's going to happen with the new car that they're going to put out this year, but he also has to manage what's happening with his two drivers, and especially getting Vettel focused going into 2019. But also, I think that the timing of the decision to part ways with Arrivabene is very, very peculiar. Don't you think? I mean, we're only, I would say, about a month away from winter testing now, when they all head down to Barcelona to break down the new cars and get them really shaken down and ready and dialed in for the new season. And we're only really about 2 months away from the first Grand Prix in the middle of March, beginning of March at Melbourne in Australia. So that really isn't a lot of time. I mean, fortunately, if you look at it from Ferrari's perspective, you're only really moving a couple of different places. Like I say, Binotto has been there for 20 years, and he's really been that guy that's been behind the scenes. Whether or not he can take that experience and all that knowledge that he has and take it from a chief engineer's, a chief technical officer's role to a team principal role, and all the associated responsibilities and decisions that are going to come along with it, we'll have to wait and see. But definitely very, very interesting to see that big move. And honestly, it's a bit of a bit of an understatement to say, but it was the surprise of the week. I don't think we really any of us saw it coming. I mean, it was reported there maybe a day or two in advance in some of the different media outlets there. But when you sort of think about it, it is, but it isn't a surprise at the same time. Now, moving along to the next team down the paddock, and there's quite a bit of news about Force India this week. And new owner Lawrence Stroll says that Force India, or Racing Point Force India, or Racing Point, or some undetermined new name for the team, could be one of F1's greatest teams. Well, that is definitely quite the statement that Lawrence Stroll has made, but I think it is fair to say that Force India at times has been a very good team, considering the amount of money that they have for a budget, the resources that they have at their disposal. I think it's fair to say that they've punched above their weight from time to time. Obviously, the beginning of the 2018 season was subpar compared to some of their previous years, and of course they were pretty much cash-strapped and limited in what they could do under the previous owner of the Vijay Mallya. And it wasn't until the team went into administration in the summer last year, which was kind of prompted by Sergio Perez claiming unpaid drivers' wages and things like that. But it really was a move that really set the whole process in motion. And I think that once the team went into administration, and Lawrence Stroll and his consortium, the group that he brought in there of investors, bought out the team and injected some new funds into it, the results for me from the first half of the season to the second half of the season, of course, the points they had accumulated up until the Hungarian Grand Prix were wiped clean, but they did very well. They had much more speed. They looked much more like the Force India that we'd seen over the past several seasons. Obviously not a race-winning contender, but definitely one of those best of the rest kind of teams. So we're going to see what's going to happen now with the injection of the cash flow and they're going to have more resources and more finances available to them. So what they're going to be able to do with that in terms of developing a better car and a faster car, and maybe a car that contends, well, that again is going to be a wait and see situation. Stroll said, and I quote, short term, we want to stay where we are, and in the long term, we want to be moving further up the grid. So that is definitely a lofty ambition, and he definitely is got some expectations for that team. And he says, again, nothing is broke here, so you don't need to fix it. And he said, number two, it's about putting financial stability in place. And definitely that is a key component, because I was pretty worried last year. Not that I'm the biggest fan of Force India, but I like to see stability in Formula One. And of course, under the Bernie Ecclestone regime over the previous 4 decades, Bernie really didn't care one way or another. It was like, if you had the money and the resources to be in Formula One, great, you're here. If not, then so what? If you don't have the money, then you don't deserve to be here. But at the same time, I mean, I understand that point of view, of course. I mean, Formula One is intended to be the best of the best, but at the same time, I do like to see some continuity in the grid, in the amount of teams and the manufacturers that you see in Formula One. And of course, they all come and go because these big companies have different reasons and different motivations for being in Formula One. And it could be not only that it doesn't financially make sense anymore, but it also at some points could be just that they've proven everything that they set out to prove, and they've want to focus their attention on something else. But it is nice to see teams struggle and kind of go on life support. I mean, we've seen it over the past couple of years with Manor Racing. We saw it with Lotus. We saw it with Caterham. Of course, Lotus was bought out by Renault. Talk about Renault in a minute here, but it was good to see Racing Point, Force India get rescued. So we'll wait and see. Do you think they're going to stick with the pink livery for next year, or is it going to be something different? Wait and see. But apparently the sponsors that they had seemed pretty supportive at the time when they went through the administration period. But definitely quite an ambitious claim made by Lawrence Stroll. Now, Esteban Ocon, who is a former Racing Point Force India driver. Of course, he was the odd man out when the musical chairs in the Formula One drivers market stopped last year, and ended up basically losing his seat to his very good friend, Lance Stroll, who moved over from Williams and is also conveniently the son of the owner of Racing Point. But hey, I guess if you have all the money in the world, then you can make things work for you. But still, Esteban reckons that Force India are what he calls, quote unquote, close to closing the massive gap between Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull, and the advantage that they enjoy over the midfield. Now, wow, again, this is another big boast or big claim or statement by somebody that's, well, obviously not with the team anymore, but definitely a very, very interesting statement by Esteban Ocon. And yeah, well, What do you make of that? I mean, honestly, what it's going to come down to is what they do with the car over the winter, how they develop and design the car for next year, of course, and whether or not they're able to make use of the money and the resources that Lawrence Stroll has made available to the team. So this is this funny time of year. Of course, you hear some of these things coming out every now and again. There was something earlier this week that Romain Grosjean was saying something that Renault should look out for Haas, blah blah blah, these sorts of things. And of course, at this time of year, it's really great because depending where you are and where you're looking in or out from, I mean, if you're in the factory and looking at all the designs and all the claims that your engineers and designers are making, that's one thing. Oh yeah, well, we've improved so much over the car from last year, and we've never made so many performance gains over the course of a winter. Sure, that's great, but when it all comes down and shakes out on the racetrack, it usually tends to be the same thing. You have a couple of big teams out at the front, and over the last couple of years, it's been Mercedes and Ferrari, then Red Bull, and then everybody else, and at the very back, Williams. More about Williams in a minute as well. And Ocon, he did say that he was very impressed by the professionalism of the team and the motivation that they have for the results. They're hungry. It makes a difference. They don't count the hours that they put into the work that they have or that they need to put in to make the team competitive. And of course, those are all important things. But if you kind of go and take these really big, really confident claims and statements by Stroll and by Esteban Ocon, you sort of juxtapose that with what the team principal Otmar Safnauer is saying, and he's basically saying they must be wary of what he calls the perils of the improved backing, or risk losing what made it so potent as Force India. So he said that they have a reputation that they really, what he called a best for its buck or a bang for its buck kind of team. And like I was saying, they punched above their weight, and they did things very well and very efficient. But now they have more money, more resources, and they need to focus that. So they have to stay focused and stay as efficient as they were, or else, they could end up just, I guess the best way to say it is lose that focus and go down and develop technologies or develop the car in ways that aren't really the best and most relevant to what's happening on the track. And Safnauer himself even said, quote, "We have to make sure we don't start going all over the place." So definitely, it'll be one thing to watch what that happens this year and next year, because Lawrence Stroll is definitely targeting beyond 2021 or 2020 and 2021 when everything is all really changed. And we don't know what's going to happen in 2020 or 2021 when the new regulations come out. But we'll see. They want to try and fight for third instead of fourth place in the championship and in the races. And well, that really depends on how far ahead of everyone else that the big three stay. Definitely, Mercedes have to be considered the front runner each and every year. There's no reason not to think that they won't be the best team again this year. Of course, Ferrari is going to be the situation to watch. When they're changing at the guard that we just discussed, and then of course, the other interesting situation is what's going to happen with Honda and Red Bull Racing. Honda had said last year that they want to make sure that they deliver an engine that is at least on par with the Renault power that Red Bull has had over the past several years, and at times provided some very good results for them last year. Of course, they managed to win a handful of races, and that was probably pretty unexpected at the time. So Honda definitely have to start putting their money where their mouth is. All right. So, well, just sticking with the Force India theme here, and just talking now about Stroll Jr., and that is Lance Stroll. And Lance says that he believes that in 2018 he improved consistency despite the struggles that he had and Williams had as a team as whole. And he said, and I quote, "I've definitely been more consistent. When I haven't been there or I've made mistakes, it's been on less of a scale compared to last year. Last year when I was on a high, it was really good and the position was good. And when I struggled, I really, really struggled. And now I'm a bit more consistent." Well, he's now got 2 years behind him in Formula One. He's no longer the young, fresh-faced rookie. He might be young and fresh-faced, but he does have that benefit of experience behind him. And definitely, I think going to Force India, and obviously what with his dad being the owner of the team now, that the team might be a little bit more focused around him. Of course, Sergio Perez, he's really become like that he's like that one guy. When I think of Force India, I do think of Sergio Perez. I mean, he's really ingrained himself in that team over the past couple of years. So it's an interesting choice of driver lineups, but definitely I think we'll see what Lance Stroll is made of. Obviously the Williams FW41 last year was completely wrong, basically in every regard. They struggled every race of the year, and they never really did seem to get that car figured out or were able to improve upon any of the problems. And we've seen over the past several years that Force India have been able to design a pretty solid and a pretty reliable car. So it'll be fun to watch and see what Lance Stroll is really made of. Should he be at Force India? Should he be in F1, or is he just there for other reasons? We'll wait and see. It definitely is a situation that I'm sure he's looking forward to getting into, because Esteban Ocon and Sergio Perez, despite the clashes that those two have had on the track over the past couple of years, obviously they've had a pretty competitive car underneath them, and I'm sure Lance is looking forward to being in that situation and taking advantage of it this year. So now talking about another midfield or back of the grid team, or maybe not so, we're not destined to be at the back of the team or league, or back of the grid. I'm getting my sports mixed up here. Back of the grid team. And this one is Sauber, quote, pushed like hell on 2019 car early. And I'm impressed with how Sauber turned it around. I mean, 2017 wasn't a good year for them. I mean, they had those 2016 Ferrari engines in the back of the car, and they were designed for a completely different style, a different era of Formula One, because 2017, a lot of the technical regulations had changed. The engines were one of them, and it just did not provide the oomph that that car needed. And Pascal Wehrlein and Marcus Ericsson, they just weren't able to really be competitive, and they were really stuck to the back of the field that year. So this year with the Ferrari engines, and they had a more up-to-date spec in it and more design, and they had a pretty decent pairing. Obviously, Charles Leclerc was the star, and Ericsson, he had his moments, not very many. He had a couple towards the end of the season. Of course, he's off to IndyCar now, because this year, what with Leclerc moving up to Ferrari, completely different lineup we're going to see at Sauber for a couple of races at the beginning of 2017. And then, of course, Kimi Räikkönen, who's passing Charles Leclerc, going from Ferrari over to Sauber. So you've got a young guy in Giovinazzi that has a little bit of Formula One experience, and then the wily old vet and world champion and Kimi Räikkönen, who says he's moving to Sauber, where it all started for him, because he wants to. In typical Kimi manner and Kimi fashion, I can't think of a better way to sum it up. But they really have put a lot of time into the development of this car. But it was a real surprise last year that the C37, which is the car that they put out last year, was basically one of the fastest cars by the end of the year. And Charles Leclerc was a regular in Q3, and he said it was and Charles Leclerc, should clarify, insisted that the constant progression was the result of him understanding the car, rather the ongoing development. And Frederick Vasseur said that the Sauber did not compromise this year at all, and they really pushed early on to develop this car and really move as many resources that they could to develop this car for 2019 as early as possible. But I mean, a lot of things are changing, and in Formula One, and it's really. It's interesting to see how cars and teams are developing, and who's moving up and down the grid. And we'll talk about Williams and McLaren in a minute here. But I really I've really been impressed by teams like Sauber, and to extent, Renault maybe not quite as much, but they definitely they've made some interesting comments over the gains in their engine and their output in the engine that they've designed and built for this year. So whether or not they can continue to push up and become a more regular contender, rather being really stuck in the middle of the midfield, where they were. They to me last year, they kind of had a couple of moments here and there, and then they kind of stagnated. But Sauber really were the most impressive team in the midfield for me. I mean, you look at them moving forward, and you see teams like McLaren and Williams going backwards. And, well, honestly, I haven't really seen anything to really give me too much confidence or really feel like Williams or McLaren are going to turn it around anytime soon. Sometimes you see a team have a little bit of resurgence at the end of the year, and well, not necessarily they can carry it over because one car from one year is completely different to a car that comes out for the next season. But definitely, you just don't feel like they've got all the pieces in place, and even though they've got lots of money and knowledge and experience behind them, it just doesn't feel like the momentum is there, and it just doesn't feel like they're getting it done properly. And you see teams like Force India, you see teams like Sauber doing so much more with so much less. And it really is impressive to see that. And whether or not the other teams like McLaren and Williams can move forward and get back off the back of the grid there, again, that's just going to be a waiting game. We haven't really seen that, and we really haven't seen the signs of it. I mean, obviously McLaren has used that excuse of the Honda engine for a couple of years, and rightfully so in many occasions, but a lot of their own design flaws were really brought to light in the car that they had last year, because they weren't even really able to compete with the Renault works team, who basically they have the same engines in the back of the car. So that is a big concern, obviously. And then Williams, they have Mercedes power, arguably the best engine in Formula One over the past 4 or 5 seasons. And they were at the back of the grid. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I don't even think they struck double digits in the in the Constructors' Championship last year. When you think that this is a team that has over 40 years experience in Formula One and has multiple world drivers and Constructors' Championships under their belts, I mean, there's been many well-known drivers that have won the World Championship driving a Williams car, like Alan Jones, Nelson Piquet, Nigel Mansell, Alain Prost, Nigel Mansell already mentioned, Damon Hill, Jacques Villeneuve. I mean, the list, it's an impressive list. And if you look at the amount of races that they won, and if you go back, and for those of you that have F1 TV, I suggest you go back and watch some of the races in the late 1980s. 1986, there were quite a few full-length races on there. I think it was the 1986 British Grand Prix, if I can't remember, but completely dominant. You just watch Mansell and Piquet. They're lapping people after maybe 10 or 15 laps into the race. Of course, that was that weird era where you had turbo cars and normally aspirated cars, and that Jim Clark Cup or whatever they called it for the normally aspirated cars. You basically had two different formulas racing within Formula One. So there is a bit of a caveat there that it wasn't completely all their way, but still, compared to some of the other front runners like the Ferrari and McLaren and the other top teams of that era, they were absolutely dominant. And Ross Brawn, the big head honcho, the motorsport director over at Formula One, he said that the struggles that we've seen with McLaren and Williams over the past couple of years shows that there's no mercy for teams when they get it wrong, and it really doesn't matter what your history is. It's pretty much what have you been doing on the track right now. And he thinks that that they can get back to a competitive place in Formula One, but it's going to be a really, really tough job. Ross Brawn, that is, feels that if you're not doing a first-class job that's demonstrated by every Sunday, every weekend out at the track, then, there's going to be problems. And obviously, I would say that the McLaren downward spiral has been a little bit more gradual than Williams, obviously. Williams has really fallen off over the past 2 or 3 years, and it's definitely a big shock. And sticking with Ross Brawn, he says that he's impatient to make bigger changes to Formula One. And, well, I mean, obviously Ross knows what he's talking about. He's proven it as a team principal and as a designer. I mean, he has all the bona fides to back it up. But even he recognizes that he, even though he's eager to make all these changes, that he realizes he has to cool off a little bit and maybe not push as hard with the the teams. And he said that he may be satisfied the direction that discussions are going and the way that things are moving forward for the future. He's not really too satisfied with the pace, and he says he's a little bit impatient about that. And he says that he's fairly optimistic that what they're doing, that they're going to see the benefit in a couple of years. Hopefully, from our point of view as fans, obviously, I'm sure we'd like to see the benefits that they're really hoping to bring to the track, really see those manifest in more exciting races. Hopefully some really amazing looking cars and everything that we all hold dear and what makes Formula One. Really hope that becomes reality. And again, well, Ross, I mean, he'll probably understand this more than anyone else. And just talking a little bit now, we were talking just about how McLaren and Williams have really fallen off. And Ross was saying that he feels that Honda really has to understand what he calls the reality of Formula One. And of course, he would know that better than anyone, having taken over at Honda and then changing that into Braun Grand Prix, and then obviously that became Mercedes, and we all know how the Mercedes story, well, not how it ended, but definitely what it turned into. And he really feels that the secret to success with Honda is connecting the engineers to the Formula One challenges. And he said that when he was at Honda, he said he called them a little bit remote from the reality of what was needed. So he said he needed to connect the engineers and make sure that they were working on the right things and they had priorities. They had all the real information and basically the goal that was what was happening. And he said that they had a view that they had one of the best engines in Formula One. And then he said, well, of course, coming from all those years at Ferrari, he was immediately able to tell that the Honda engine wasn't really the best. And I think that obviously now maybe Honda's in a bit of a different position, rather than being a manufacturer of both a car and an engine, that they're just being solely an engine supplier, like they were back in the heyday, well, one of the heydays of McLaren, and obviously one of the heydays of Williams in the 80s and 90s. And I think going to Red Bull is a similar situation. They're obviously one of the big teams in Formula One. They're taking a bit of a chance on taking Honda as their engine supplier. But I think, and this is what Ross said, is that Red Bull will be making sure of what they need to focus on. I mean, they obviously had massive success there for several years with the Renault engine. Obviously, Sebastian Vettel won 4 world championships, and they were a powerhouse. So they know as a team what it takes to win in Formula One. And I'm pretty sure if things aren't going their way with Honda, and I'm sure they've been having the discussions already. Obviously, Toro Rosso has had Honda engines for a year now. They've had the benefit of being able to compare the engine data between Renault and Honda for a very long time, and obviously that's what really tipped the scale in Honda's favor. But still, you can't 100% take that risk away, and I think that Red Bull and Christian Horner and their whole team there will definitely keep Honda working in the right direction. And it's exciting to think, well, if they can get a good engine designed and built, I mean, come on, with a design team headed by Adrian Newey, you just know that Red Bull's going to have a good car. I mean, he's got the record to prove it. I mean, we talked about it a couple of weeks ago when we released the show about the Williams FW14B, the 1992 car with a Renault engine in it that was designed by Adrian Newey and Patrick Head. And that's just one of many amazing cars that Adrian Newey has built during his career, going all the way back to the mid-1980s, not just in Formula One, not just with Williams, not just with Red Bull, but even in karts. I mean, he's built cars that won the Indy 500. So the guy's done it all. So they know what it takes to build an amazing, like a really good race car, really good chassis. So they just need the engine to do it. And if they can, well, I'm excited at the prospect of Max Verstappen having a competitive car and a competitive engine, because he could be, and he has all the he has all the talent to be a top driver. Whether or not he can translate that into more race wins and maybe a world championship, of course, Max has got to stay focused, but definitely that complete package of a Max Verstappen, a competitive, a good chassis and a good engine, Formula One, look out. And, well, it's kind of going back to Ferrari and sticking on the Williams theme a little bit. Robert Kubica, who is going to be one of Williams' drivers for 2019, along youngster George Russell, said it was not easy to say no to a Ferrari offer of a development role in 2019. And he was offered a role to take up a simulator position with Ferrari following the departure of Antonio Giovinazzi to Sauber and Danny Kvyat to Toro Rosso. And, well, Kubica won the 2008 Canadian Grand Prix, and he wanted to make his return to Formula One. Well, he was reserve driver Williams last year, but he wanted to make a return to racing with Williams, and rather than go back in the simulator with Ferrari. And of course, even though there was the chance to go to Ferrari, you know, nothing against Kubica, but I mean, he's been out of the Formula One picture for a very, very long time. Of course, when he was a younger driver, he definitely was impressive. Of course, he had that awful, tragic accident in rally cars where he nearly lost his arm. And he's done a phenomenal job. I mean, give the guy credit. I mean, he tested with Renault, and that's what really started it off a couple of summers ago, and proved that he had what it, he still has what it takes to drive a Formula One car. But whether or not he's able to do that over the course of 20 plus races and in some of these really grueling conditions, that remains a bit of an open question. Obviously, they have confidence that Kubica can get the job done, but it is a bold choice of drivers for Williams for 2019. They've just come off a year where they had two very young and inexperienced drivers, relatively speaking, in Sergei Sirotkin and Lance Stroll, and now they've got an experienced driver in Robert Kubica and another young, inexperienced guy in George Russell, but he's got all the pedigree and all the markings of a very good racing driver and a very good Formula One driver. But you can't really fault Kubica for taking that race seat. I think that many of us would probably do the same thing, put in the same situation. Would you rather be the simulator guy who shows up with your travel mug of coffee when you show up for work in the morning, or do you want to be the guy that's in the car, doing the testing, doing the racing, going out there on the sharp end? I think that's what it's all about. I don't think anybody ever, none of these guys that are racing in Formula One really aspired to be a simulator driver. And I don't think Robert Kubica had those goals either moving along. So talking about pressure, obviously there's big pressure for Mattia Binotto at Ferrari, but equally big pressure for Valtteri Bottas to keep his seat beyond 2019 at Mercedes. And sorry for the little chuckle here, but Toto Wolff is setting the bar here awfully hard. And he says Valtteri knows exactly where he needs to be next year. He needs to have all the bad luck gone and perform on a level with Lewis. Okay, if that's what the bar is at, if you want to get a seat at Mercedes and you have to be at least as good as Lewis Hamilton, my goodness, that bar is set very, very high indeed. I mean, there is only one Lewis Hamilton. He's a 5-time world champion. He's obviously one of the quickest guys in the sport. He's one of the most consistent guys in the sport as well. Rarely puts a wheel wrong. And he's also one of the mentally toughest guys in the sport. So for Bottas to be able to live up to that and perform on a level similar to Lewis Hamilton, that is a very, very big challenge, and Toto has really thrown the gauntlet down, and whatever he needs to do, he's really going to have to improve, because Wolff has even said that he believes that Lewis has improved, and that means that Bottas needs to improve as well. But he also, in fairness, he does say that he feels that the Bottas has the potential, has the capacity to improve and to perform on a level similar to Lewis Hamilton, and it is a sentiment that is shared by Bottas himself, who obviously had some bad luck last year, going back to Baku when he ran over some debris and picked up a puncture late in the race when he was leading. That was unfortunate. But I think one of the Well, for me, I think one of the standout highlights of the entire year was that, and also then at Sochi at the Russian Grand Prix when team orders came into effect and he was told to move over and make way for Lewis Hamilton so he could maximize his points and try and capture that world championship. Again, we can get into that discussion about team orders, but when you're fighting for a world championship and there's still races to go and you don't have the thing sewn up, you got to get the points where you can get them. But definitely Bottas knows where he's at now. And well, if you weren't going to put Bottas in that car, I'm going to throw this out to you guys. Send me a tweet at Scuderia F1 Pod or email me at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. If Valtteri Bottas was not to come back to Mercedes in 2020, or let's just put it out there, who would you like to see in the second car beside Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes? So let me know, send me a tweet, throw me an email, and let's see, get some opinions in there. Anyways, talking about Renault now, they believe that their engine gains are, quote, much bigger than ever before. So again, this kind of goes back to some of the big statements that big confidence statements we were talking about, especially with Force India a little while ago. And managing director Cyril Attiboul says that he sees no evidence that the team's progress is slowing down. And he said that if anything, he sees what he calls acceleration everywhere. And he says that the gains that they're making on the engine are much bigger than we have ever done in the winter, much bigger than the gains we are currently doing in the wind tunnel, are much bigger than we have ever done. Again, well, Renault did say several years ago when they bought out Lotus, came back into Formula One after being gone as a manufacturer, not just an engine supplier, that they did have this mid-range project over the course of about 5 years, 6 years or so, which we're kind of getting to the end of now. We're in the sort of the latter stages of that to become a real contender again in Formula One. And definitely we've seen that the team progress. I mean, it's definitely better than where Lotus finished off a couple of years ago, but they're not quite up there performing with the Red Bulls. I mean, they did have the same engine in the two cars over the past couple of years, and they haven't even really been able to compete with them. They've had some moments here and there, but obviously there's still a lot of room and a lot of way to go before that Renault really is a competitive car capable of challenging for podiums, challenging for race wins, and ultimately for world championships. And it's a big goal that they have. I mean, obviously Renault Nissan is a very, very big car manufacturer, so they do have lots of technical and financial support behind them, but they really need to take that next step. And based on what Attiboul is saying, he believes that they've made a significant improvement over last year. But again, like I was saying earlier, just talking about Force India, the real acid test, of course, is it's one thing to say we've made gains in this in the wind tunnel and on the dyno, and the thing is, well, that's fine, but how do those gains compare to the other 9 teams that are going to line up beside you on the grid next year? How do you match up against those other manufacturers? And that is the ultimate test. You can have improved all that you want, but if everybody else has improved just that much better, you're still going to be slower than them. So that is just the cruel reality of Formula One. But there is a lot of positivity at Renault right now. Obviously, they've made some changes for next year, and the big one, of course, is Carlos Sainz has moved over to McLaren, and of course Danny Ricciardo, who shocked everyone, obviously, earlier this year, or in the middle of last year, I should say, obviously 2019 now, when he announced his departure from Red Bull and announced he was going over to Renault, when everybody really felt that, or at least on the outside, it felt like it was going to be another extension, another new contract for Danny Rick at Red Bull Racing. I mean, certainly, if I think back to some of the things that Christian Horner, the team principal at Red Bull Racing, was saying at the time, that it really sounded like they were just dotting the I's and crossing the T's, and they were in the very, very sort of end stages of cinching up a new deal with Danny Ricciardo. But of course, reality in Formula One is sometimes not what you expect it to be, and it's a big, bold move. But a lot of the news that and little sound bites that are coming out of Renault is that they really feel that Ricciardo's joining of the team is very much like when Alonso joined the team, and it really feels like they have that glory years kind of feel. And of course, Alonso won back-to-back championships in 2005 and 2006, so that was obviously a big boost for the team, and Ricciardo obviously taking a bit of a risk. And I still think it was interesting that in all the problems that Red Bull had with the Renault engine, we heard Max Verstappen especially have a bleep fueled tirade on race radio in Hungary when the engine let go. And Christian Horner has been very critical of Renault over the past several years, to the point that Attibull actually said that, we've basically tuned that guy out and stopped listening to him a long time ago. So it was just kind of funny, out of those 3-4 really big names at Red Bull Racing, Ricciardo was never really the one guy that said anything outwardly caustic or really acidic about the Renault engine. I think from time to time he would maybe state his disappointment if there was a problem with the engine or something like that, but he wasn't out making an inflammatory or insulting remark about the engine. So I always thought it was kind of interesting that he didn't necessarily burn those bridges with Renault or damage any relationship with them. And if they turn out to have a good car and a good season, and if Ricciardo can be a contender or get some good results in that car, maybe get similar results that he had in the Red Bull, hopefully better from his point of view, then it will have been a situation that was very wise on his behalf. But of course, that will all play out over the next 9 or 10 months, and we will know come next November, maybe even sooner, depending how the season goes, good or bad for Danny Ricciardo and Renault. But definitely, like I was saying earlier in the show, that this is the time of year where everybody's making a lot of big boasts and a lot of things and a lot of statements out there in the media, and it will really be proven either right or wrong, or just empty statements or promises or boasts, whatever you want to call it, when the cars finally hit the track on the asphalt in Melbourne in a couple of months. So finally, to close out the show tonight, there was some other news a bit concerning that Niki Lauda is in hospital with the flu. He was flown back. I think maybe he was in Spain or somewhere on holidaying, and he's gone back to the hospital in Vienna where he had the lung transplant last summer, and he's been convalescing and recovering from that. And prior to this news, there was a suggestion that he was targeting recovering and regaining his health enough to be in Melbourne in 2 months' time. So hopefully Lauda is back to full health soon, and that this situation that he's having with the flu right now is nothing too major, and we hope certainly that he gets better soon. Anyways, that is a wrap for this week. Thank you so very much for listening. If you want to get in touch with us, easiest way is on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod, or email us at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com. That's a wrap. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again this time next week.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to scuderiaf1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at scuderiaf1pod@gmail.com.
You were listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us, sportspodcastingnetwork.com.